I used to believe my life was finally settling into place. At 27, I had a steady career, a man I thought I could trust, and a family that, while not perfect, felt like home. I used to wake up next to Nathan's steady breathing and think, this is what safety feels like. My little sister Clara would visit, and the three of us would laugh together over wine late into the night. Back then, I thought I was building a future surrounded by love. I was wrong. Looking back, I realized there were signs. Clara's smile lingered too long when Nathan entered the room. His eyes darted to her when he thought I wasn't watching. But at the time, I convinced myself it was nothing. Sisters and fiancés can get along, right? I told myself I was just paranoid, stressed by wedding planning. The first real crack appeared one Saturday afternoon. Clara had come over to help me with invitations. But we barely touched them. She sat too close to Nathan on the couch, laughing at his dumb jokes in a way she never laughed at mine. When I tried to pull her into the kitchen to help me, she rolled her eyes and muttered, "Relax, Ev. Not everything's about you." I brushed it off, but the words stung. The following weeks were a blur of small moments that gnawed at me, Clara texting at odd hours and quickly turning her phone face down when I entered the room. Nathan suddenly being busy at work more often. My mother making sly comments about how some women know how to keep a man interested, always while glancing at Clara. I wanted to scream, but I kept silent, clinging to the hope that I was imagining things. The truth came crashing down on a Tuesday evening. I had stayed late at work, exhausted but eager to come home. When I walked into our apartment, Nathan was in the shower. His phone lay on the nightstand, screen glowing with notifications. I don't know what made me pick it up. Maybe intuition, maybe desperation. What I saw hollowed me out. Messages from Clara, not just flirty words, but confessions. I can't wait until she's out of the picture. Last night was incredible. Promise me you'll choose me. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the phone. When Nathan emerged from the bathroom, towel around his waist, I confronted him. At first he denied everything, called me paranoid. But when I shoved the phone into his chest, his face drained of color. "It just happened," he stammered. "You were so busy with work. And Clara—" "Clara?" I snapped. "My sister?" He couldn't meet my eyes. That was all the answer I needed. I drove to my parents' house in a haze, shaking so hard I could barely keep the wheel straight. Clara was there, curled up on the couch with a smug little smile, as if she had been waiting for me. When I screamed at her, she didn't apologize. She laughed. "You were always so uptight," she said coldly. "Nathan deserves someone who actually makes him happy." My mother rushed in, demanding to know what the noise was about. When I told her, she didn't even look surprised. She placed a hand on Clara's shoulder and said, "Evelyn, you always overreact. Maybe if you weren't so difficult, this wouldn't have happened." In that moment, something inside me snapped. My father sat silently in the corner, avoiding my gaze, pretending to be invisible as usual. My own family, the people who were supposed to protect me, chose her. That night, I lay awake in my empty apartment, replaying their words, their faces. I felt as though I had been gutted and left to rot. But beneath the pain, something darker began to stir. A voice I had never truly listened to before whispered, "They will not get away with this." It was the first time I thought about revenge. Not just anger, not just heartbreak, but cold, deliberate revenge. And once that thought entered my mind, it refused to leave. The days after the discovery were the darkest of my life. I woke up every morning with that raw, splitting pain in my chest, the kind that makes it hard to breathe. I would stare at the ceiling and ask myself how my own sister could do this to me. How Nathan, the man who once swore he loved me, could betray me so easily. Friends tried to comfort me, but I couldn't even explain it properly. It wasn't just a breakup. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a violation of everything I had believed in: trust, family, loyalty, all shattered in an instant. At first, I thought maybe Nathan and Clara would come to their senses. Maybe they would realize the cruelty of what they'd done. But instead, the opposite happened. Nathan moved out within a week, carrying only a few bags. He didn't even look me in the eye as he left. I heard through mutual friends that he was staying at Clara's apartment. The image of them together, cooking in her kitchen, sleeping in her bed, made me physically sick. Worse than that were my parents. My mother, Margaret, acted as though nothing unusual had happened. When I visited her to try and talk, she told me I was being childish and that I needed to move on with dignity. She said love was unpredictable and that maybe Nathan and Clara were meant to be, meant to be. I wanted to scream, to smash every glass in her kitchen, to make her feel even a fraction of what I felt. Instead, I walked out without saying a word, tears burning my face. My father, Daniel, was no better. He didn't defend me, didn't confront Clara or Nathan. He just sighed and muttered things like, "You can't control who people fall in love with," as though that excused the betrayal. His silence cut even deeper than my mother's cruelty. The only person who truly listened was Olivia, my best friend since college. When I broke down in her apartment, she held me until I couldn't cry anymore. "Ev, they don't deserve your tears," she whispered. "You're better than them. One day, you'll leave all of this behind." But I didn't want to leave it behind. Not anymore. Every smile Clara flashed on social media, every photo Nathan posted beside her, every comment my mother made about how happy they looked together fed the fire inside me. I stopped eating properly. Sleep became impossible. Instead, I filled notebooks with thoughts, lists, fragments of plans. At first, they were just fantasies, things I would never actually do. But the more I wrote, the more those fantasies solidified into something sharper, something real. One evening, I made the mistake of attending a family dinner. I thought maybe it would give me closure, or at least the chance to speak my truth. Instead, it became the moment I realized there was no going back. Clara arrived arm in arm with Nathan, wearing the bracelet I had given her on her 21st birthday. She paraded him around the room as if he were some prize she had fairly won. My mother gushed over them, pouring Nathan extra wine, while I sat at the table gripping my fork so hard my knuckles turned white. At one point, Clara leaned over and whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "He says I'm better in bed." Something inside me froze. Not rage, not yet, but a kind of stillness. A deadly calm. I left that dinner without saying goodbye. I remember walking through the night air, every step echoing with clarity. That was the moment the decision crystallized in my mind. If they were so comfortable destroying me, then I would destroy them in return. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to cry in front of them ever again. No, I would be patient, careful, ruthless. I started small, observing, taking notes, watching how Nathan and Clara moved, where they worked, who they talked to. I remembered things Nathan had confessed to me in confidence, mistakes at work, shady dealings he thought no one knew about. I recalled the way Clara bragged about her friends, her ambitions, her weaknesses. They thought they had won. They thought I was broken, powerless. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Because the truth was, I wasn't powerless at all. I had information, I had patience, and most importantly, I had nothing left to lose. That's when the revenge truly began. The first step in any revenge, I realized, is patience. Clara and Nathan believed the storm had passed. They paraded their relationship openly, posting smiling pictures online, showing up together at family gatherings, pretending they were just another happy couple. To everyone else, it looked like I was the bitter ex who couldn't move on. They had no idea I was watching, waiting, and collecting every thread that could unravel them. Nathan was the easier target. He had always been careless with money. When we were engaged, I handled most of our finances because he hated responsibility. I remembered late-night confessions after a few drinks, that he had skimmed money at his company, cut corners, even lied to clients to make quick bonuses. Back then, I ignored it, blinded by love. Now, those memories became weapons. I began to dig. At first, I scrolled through old emails, bank statements, scraps of notes he'd left around. Then I reached out to an old coworker of his under the guise of curiosity. The more I asked, the more I uncovered. There were rumors of Nathan double-charging clients, pocketing extra, and flirting his way into deals that should never have been his. It wasn't enough to confront him outright. No, I wanted it to be undeniable. So I quietly copied documents, screenshots, and conversations, compiling them into a neat little folder. I didn't send it anywhere yet. I simply waited, polishing the weapon until it gleamed. Clara was different. She thrived on attention. My sister always needed to be admired, envied, the center of the room. Her Instagram was full of designer clothes, expensive restaurants, weekend trips. But I knew she couldn't afford most of it on her own salary, which meant someone else was footing the bill. Nathan, or worse, the men she flirted with on the side, because Clara was never satisfied with one admirer. I began shadowing her, not physically at first, but digitally. I knew her passwords. She had always been careless with them, using the same variation of our childhood pet's name for everything. Slipping into her accounts was easy. What I found made me sick. Flirtatious messages with other men while Nathan slept beside her. Promises of exclusive weekends. If they helped pay for her shopping sprees. Screenshots piled up quickly. There was something intoxicating about it. The quiet power of knowing their secrets while they strutted around in ignorance. At work, I pretended everything was fine. With Olivia, I played the role of the wounded friend slowly healing. But inside, I was sharpening knives. The real test came 2 months later, when my mother invited us all for a Sunday dinner. I nearly said no, but then I realized it was the perfect stage. Clara arrived late, as always, dragging Nathan behind her like a trophy. She wore a new dress, the kind she couldn't possibly afford, and a smug smile that made my stomach twist. My mother fussed over them, cooing about how happy they looked. My father sat quietly, sipping his wine, pretending nothing was wrong. I sat across from them, calm, silent, watching. When Nathan reached for Clara's hand, I imagined what would happen if I slipped the folder of evidence onto his boss's desk. When Clara bragged about her promotion, I thought about the screenshots that could ruin her reputation forever. At one point, Clara leaned across the table and said sweetly, "Ev, you should try dating again. Not everyone can be alone forever, you know." Everyone chuckled, as if her cruelty was just playful teasing. I smiled back, though it didn't reach my eyes. "You're right," I said evenly. "Not everyone gets what they deserve. But eventually, they do." For a moment, the table went quiet. Clara's smirk faltered, just slightly. Nathan shifted uncomfortably. Then the conversation moved on. But I saw it, the first flicker of unease. That night, lying awake in my bed, I realized something dangerous. I wasn't just planning revenge anymore. I was starting to enjoy it. The control, the anticipation, the secret knowledge that I could bring their entire world crashing down whenever I chose. Olivia noticed the change in me. Over coffee one afternoon, she frowned and said, "Ev, you're different." I mean, I get it. They hurt you in the worst possible way. But don't lose yourself in this. Don't let them turn you into someone else. I wanted to listen. I wanted to be the bigger person. But when I closed my eyes, all I could see was Clara's smile and Nathan's betrayal. And the truth was, it was already too late. I wasn't the same Evelyn anymore. I wasn't healing. I was preparing. And soon, very soon, they would understand exactly what that meant. Revenge is like planting a seed. You bury it deep, water it with patience, and wait for it to grow in silence. That's how it felt in those weeks. Quiet, deliberate, methodical. Every day, I woke up with a sense of purpose. Not to move on, not to heal, but to prepare. My first strike was subtle. Nathan had always been reckless with his job, bragging about deals he shouldn't have made, whispering things to me in bed he thought I'd never repeat. I remembered enough details to know where to look. Using the documents I had collected, I crafted an anonymous email and sent it to his company's compliance department. I didn't include everything, not yet, just enough to make them suspicious. 2 weeks later, word got back to me through a mutual friend. Nathan was under investigation. He had been called into meetings, questioned about discrepancies in his accounts. Clara posted a photo of him on social media with the caption, "Rough week, but we're stronger than ever." I almost laughed out loud. Stronger than ever? They had no idea the ground beneath them was already cracking. Clara, on the other hand, needed a different approach. She thrived on attention, on the illusion of being perfect. So I decided to chip away at that facade. I anonymously leaked screenshots of her flirtatious messages to one of the men's wives, a woman I knew from town, someone who had always disliked Clara's smugness. It didn't take long before whispers started spreading. At first, Clara brushed them off, but I could tell it rattled her when I saw her delete half her Instagram posts overnight. Still, it wasn't enough. I wanted them to feel the way I had felt, exposed, powerless, humiliated. The opportunity came during another family gathering. This time, it was for my father's birthday. I almost skipped it, but then I realized it was the perfect stage for my next move. The dinner started like any other. My mother doting on Clara, ignoring me. My father quietly sipping his whiskey. Nathan arrived late, his shirt wrinkled, tension written all over his face. Clara whispered to him furiously before they sat down, and I knew their perfect little romance wasn't as stable as they pretended. Halfway through dinner, my mother turned to me and asked in that condescending tone, "So, Evelyn, have you finally found someone new? Or are you still lingering?" Clara giggled, leaning against Nathan like she owned him. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to stay calm. Instead of answering, I looked directly at Nathan and said, "Funny thing about lingering, some mistakes linger longer than you expect. Sometimes they catch up with you." His fork froze halfway to his mouth. Clara frowned, confused. My father glanced at me but said nothing. My mother rolled her eyes and changed the subject, but the seed was planted later that night as I drove home. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Stop this, Evelyn." No name, no context. But I knew it was Nathan. That only fueled me more. If he was scared enough to text me, it meant my work was taking effect. Olivia noticed the shift in me again. Over drinks one evening, she studied me carefully and said, "Ev, I know you're doing something. You have that look. Please don't let them drag you down with them. You're better than this." But I wasn't sure anymore. Was I better? Or was I finally being honest with myself? That cruelty deserved cruelty in return. What I knew for certain was this: they hadn't reached the bottom yet. I wanted them desperate. I wanted them broken. And the next steps I had in mind would take them exactly there. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but they never told me how many small, quiet cuts make it lethal. By the time autumn arrived, my life had narrowed to a single axis. Make them feel the same exposure, the same bruising humiliation I'd carried for months. Nathan's investigation widened. I hadn't sent everything at once. Patience meant choosing the right moments. The compliance team had started looking into discrepancies. But corporations move slowly, and I wanted impact, not a quiet audit. So I targeted the faces that mattered to him, his major clients. Nathan had always boasted about one account in particular, a boutique design firm that paid well and looked good on his resume. I found the firm's senior partner on LinkedIn, looked up every public email and press release, and sent a careful, anonymous package. Selected screenshots of Nathan's messages, copies of altered invoices, and a short clinical description of what he'd been doing. No accusations beyond the evidence. Let them ask the questions. Within a week, the firm called Nathan. He stammered on the phone in front of Clara when he realized the inquiry was about him. I watched his face go pale in a video he later posted of their date night, and I felt, what? A hot, horrible satisfaction. Watching them pretend everything was fine while their world tilted quietly beneath them became its own form of power. Clara's unraveling took a different shape. A woman in town who'd once competed with her over men in wardrobes, someone Clara had publicly humiliated years ago, suddenly had a dossier on her phone. I can't say I didn't engineer it. An email sent from an anonymous account, screenshots attached, subject line, "For the right hands." The woman forwarded it without thinking to a few of her friends. Gossip moved faster than investigations. Within 48 hours, Clara's carefully cultivated image, her brunch photos, her designer receipts, the friends who'd always liked her posts, shifted from admiration to quiet distance. Invitations didn't arrive. Dinners were subtly unmentioned. People who used to echo her laughter now glanced away in mid-conversation. My mother, bless her selective conscience, noticed. She watched Clara with a new protectiveness that simultaneously infuriated and pained me, an instinct to shield her favorite, to repair what was broken for the child she'd always favored. My father, predictably, avoided eye contact and made jokes that never landed. The house was a stage where they acted normal and failed. When Nathan was placed on administrative leave pending the audit, Clara took to social media to tell a different story. How resilient they were, how love survived hardship. "We're stronger than ever," she wrote. The same line she'd used before. The comments were a blend of sympathy and thinly veiled curiosity. Someone asked what had actually happened. Someone else left a laughing emoji. I I wanted to answer every comment with the truth, to make it brutal and sharp and unignorable. Instead, I let silence be my weapon. The more the world closed in on them, the more reckless they became. Nathan drank more. Clara started showing up at family events with a forced cheerfulness that trembled at the edges. They began to fight, whispers at night, slam doors. I heard fragments through the thin walls of my childhood apartment when I stayed over for closure. At times I thought I saw real fear in their eyes. At others, they put on the old act of invincibility, the pretense that their happiness was unshakable. That was the part I wanted to erase. But with every victory came a hollowing. Olivia's face haunted me. She didn't speak of moral high ground. She spoke of me. "You used to make me laugh," she said once, voice small, as if she were afraid my laughter might snap. "Now you talk about them like they are objects, Ev. You're making lists like it's a game." I listened and felt something like shame flicker through me. I remembered nights when I'd sat in Nathan's arms and believed the future. I remembered how gentle his hand had been, how real some of it had felt. That memory put a splinter in everything I now used to justify. I tried to ignore it. I told myself the end justified the means. People destroy you. You don't let them walk away untouched. But at 2 a.m, when the house was quiet and the city outside my window breathed, I would sometimes catch myself replaying a laugh Nathan had given me, or a childish, sincere grin on Clara's face when she was 6 and still loved the world. Those small human things were the parts that left the deepest ache, because my revenge, even so far, required that I reduce them to flaws and patterns, erase the better parts to punish the worse. Then came the night that made me realize I had miscalculated how close to the edge I'd been walking. It was a rainy Thursday. Nathan and Clara argued loudly in the street beneath my parents' townhouse, so loud the neighbors could hear. I stood at my window and watched them through the blur of rain. Clara slapped at Nathan's face, and he grabbed her forearm so hard that her wine glass fell and shattered. Her hand bled. He swore at her, and something in his voice sounded raw, like a man who had finally recognized the ruin he had built. I didn't move. I had thought the plan would end in firmer things: job loss, social exile, financial strain. I hadn't planned for blood. Yet that image of Clara's arm, her red smear against her pale skin, gnawed at me. Part of me wanted to gloat, to think this was the inevitable collapse I'd engineered. Another part of me, quieter and colder, cataloged details: a neighbor's testimony, a memory of Nathan's temper from before the affair, how Bridget, the neighbor, would remember the shouting if the police asked. A new thought planted itself in me. What happens when people break in ways you didn't intend? When collateral damage appears on the sidewalk under the rain? I went to bed that night and dreamt of glass and rain and hands reaching for me that weren't mine. When I woke, the plan still hummed in my blood. But now, threaded through my satisfaction, there was dread. Not of getting caught, but of getting so good at destroying that I woke up and found nothing left to love, not even in myself. After the fight in the rain, everything began to accelerate, as if some hidden gear had been nudged and released. Nathan's administrative leave turned into suspension. Clients who once praised his charm now called for meetings, then left. Clara's invitations dwindled until she was left with a smattering of sympathetic messages and the hollow affirmation of strangers on social media. My anonymous nudges had become avalanches. I had expected ruin, but ruin arrived with faces and names I could see in the mirror. My mother's behavior shifted too, but not toward me. She doubled down on Clara with a ferocity that felt almost religious. She stayed up nights calling friends, begging them to stand by her girl. When I tried to speak to her, to explain how cruelly they'd treated me, she clipped the conversation short. "You made your bed, Ev," she said once, voice sharp. "This is your cross to bear." The way she framed it made me sick. It was as if my pain had been a choice, my betrayal a performance worthy of punishment. Nathan, cornered and desperate, started drinking in ways I hadn't seen before. He emailed me once, a short, erratic message that alternated between threats and apologies. I didn't answer. Part of me wanted to gloat that my messages had forced him into that state. Another quieter part worried at the edges, imagining the man I had once loved hollowed out into rage. Clara, for all her public bravado, began to crack in private. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that she was seeing a therapist, crying for reasons she refused to explain. Her new boyfriend, if they could still be called that, was erratic, alternately clingy and furious. I watched her attempt apologies that were performative, meant more for public consumption than private remorse. She posted videos about growth and learning, while deleting comments that questioned her motives. The family house was a low, constant pressure. Small talk at gatherings was replaced by silence heavy enough to cut through. My father retreated deeper into his armchair, flipping through the newspaper, as if the ink could shield him from involvement. Once, when my mother accused me of coldness, he finally spoke up in a way he rarely did. We did what we thought best for the family. His voice was thin and ashamed, not the steady, protective timbre he'd shown when I was a child. That admission, soft and reluctant, felt like a crack in the wall I'd planted between myself and any hope for reconciliation. Still, I pushed on. The satisfaction of watching them stumble became an addicting, brief high. I started to ration my interactions, choosing moments to nudge, to reveal, to withhold. When Nathan's former client publicly hinted at impropriety, I watched the comments spike and felt that cold ember of triumph, but triumph had a sticky residue. Guilt. Olivia's warnings grew more urgent now. One rainy Sunday, she dragged me to the park and sat on the bench until I smelled the damp earth on her coat. "You're losing parts of yourself you can't get back," she said, fingers entwined. "You chase them, and in the process, you become the thing you hate." Her eyes were steady and direct. "What if they deserve consequences, but not this? What if you could stop before you cause something you can't fix?" I wanted to argue. I wanted to say that I had already fixed what needed fixing. But she was right in a way that unsettled me. I didn't just want justice anymore. I wanted domination, to watch them grovel, to see their versions of life collapse. That craving sat heavy in my chest. The closer they came to the edge, the more dangerous their reactions. Nathan started following me sometimes, a step behind at the grocery store, lingering in the same coffee shop. Once he appeared outside my building late at night and banged on my door until I called the police. He swore at me from the stoop, eyes wild, and I felt something like fear tangle with my triumph. I was responsible for the situation. I had pulled the rope and watched them dangle. But I also thought he'd brought this on himself. Then there was the night Clara showed up at my parents' house with mascara smudged and a voice that trembled when she knocked. She wanted a truce, she said. She wanted them to be family again. My mother, predictably, opened the door wide and pulled her in like a prodigal child. I watched from across the street as they embraced and felt a new, sharp ache. Partly envy, partly disgust. I could have gone over. I could have spoken then and there, laid everything bare in front of them once and for all. Instead, I walked away. What I didn't foresee was how fragile the balance could be between emotional demolition and real bodily harm. The family dinners became more tense, the arguments louder. Once, at a Thanksgiving that should have been quiet, I watched Clara stand up too quickly from the table, bump into the china cabinet, and send a cascade of glass across the floor. The sound of shattering was like dry thunder. She laughed it off awkwardly, then excused herself, clutching her side as if it hurt. That night, she called my mother and demanded money I'd never heard her ask for before. My mother paid without hesitation, but the money changed things. It made Clara's weaknesses visible and gave me the chance to make them public. The threads I'd been pulling tangled in ways I hadn't predicted. When people are desperate, they do reckless things. When they are alone, they find a different kind of courage. My plan, once neat and controlled, began to show its seams. There were whispers now that I had stepped too far. A man at work who'd always been gentle with me asked if I was sure I wanted to carry on with what I was doing. Even my therapist's notes, a habit I had taken up to prove to myself that I hadn't lost my mind, hinted at a woman walking a narrow ledge, balancing between justified anger and something more corrosive. Even so, when the night came that everything shifted, it didn't feel like an endpoint. It felt like a release. A long-held breath finally expelled. I couldn't see then how much I had already lost in the muscle memory of planning revenge. I only knew the clarity that arrived when all the players were set and the last move loomed. The night everything shifted started like every other tense family gathering. Thin smiles, forced toasts. the quiet machinery of courtesy trying to mask ruin. My mother had insisted on a Sunday supper, calling it an attempt to heal the family. I knew better. She wanted a tableau. Margaret with her girls, Daniel dutiful and pale, the wounded party set aside like a flaw someone else should fix. I agreed to go because control always felt better from the center of the room. You could see everyone, you could time your moves, and you could fool yourself, believe you were still orchestrating. Clara arrived late, hair escaping a careless bun, cheeks pink from crying, or wine. I couldn't tell which. Nathan followed, shoulders hunched, a man who had once tried to look like a hero and now resembled a cornered animal. The air in the dining room was heavy with things unsaid. My father tried small talk and failed. My mother's smiles had that brittle edge I'd come to dread. I sat opposite them, fork untouched, watching the old familiar choreography of family tension. After dinner, when someone suggested dessert, Clara excused herself to the kitchen, and Nathan stayed behind. I was close enough to hear their low voices through the doorway, the cadence of an argument folded into whispers. He moved toward the kitchen, and she stepped out, wiping her hands on a towel like a hostess who wanted to appear composed. A clatter from the sink, maybe a dropped glass, made everyone start. It was stupid, domestic. The absurdity of it made me breathe a little easier. Then Clara made a move I hadn't expected. She came into the living room, eyes scanning the faces, and instead of apologizing or begging, she fixed me with a look that was all cold calculation. "Ev," she said, air soft, "I think it's time we talked. Not like this." Her voice called for attention, for the performance she knew how to give. I stood. I suppose I should have sat. Perhaps I should have left. Pride makes fools of us all. Revenge makes liars of our better angels. I walked toward her. "Fine," I said, voice steady. "Talk." Everyone's gaze slid to us, as if the room itself were a jury waiting for testimony. She started with small accusations about me, about my temper, about how I had pushed Nathan away. I answered with facts, with the little prepared things I'd practiced in my head. The messages, the denials, the nights Nathan claimed to work late. Her mouth twisted. She laughed once, an ugly sound, and said, "Do you really think anyone believes you? Everyone knows you hold grudges." There was a label in her tone I hadn't heard so plainly: crazy, bitter, hysterical. It was a weapon my mother liked to use. I felt something primitive surge up, a need to strip away the falsehood with raw, brutal honesty. I spoke louder, and then I spoke truth. About the messages, about Nathan's lies at work, about the way she had courted men and favored power over kindness. I watched as people shifted, as their faces flickered from surprise to discomfort. For a moment, I thought I was winning, exposing the rot in bright daylight. Nathan stood up, voice curled in a snarl. "You're both wrong," he said. "You're making this personal. Stop." He moved toward Clara as if to take her hand, to calm, but the movement looked more like possession than peace. Clara stepped back, eyes wide, and for a second I saw fear there, raw and plain. Then she pushed him. It was not a soft shove. It was sharp and furious, the kind that carries the weight of months of humiliation. He grabbed her forearm hard. I saw the vein in his neck jump. In that instant, something inside me, calculated, clinical, slid into the background, and something raw and human took over. Voices rose. My mother yelled for calm. My father stood and tried to interpose himself like a referee who had forgotten the rules. Clara wrenched away and stumbled backward toward the sideboard where our mother's collection of glassware lived, glittering and stupidly fragile. "Don't you dare!" she spat. And in the pushing and the footsteps and the terrible momentum of a household argument, her heel caught on the fringe of the rug. For a beat, half a breath, time stretched. She reached for the table to steady herself. The corner of the sideboard lurched like a shark fin. A vase tipped. Broken glass scattered like a constellation of tiny stars across the living room floor. Clara's body hit the edge of the coffee table. Not dramatically, not with a filmic thud, but with an awful, intimate contact that made a sound like a small, mortified animal. She gasped, a sound that hollowed out my chest, and then she went still. For a second, I thought she was stunned. And then I saw the blood, thin and shocking. and the way her face slackened. Nathan recoiled as if struck. My mother screamed my name, then a prayer slipped out of her mouth that I had never heard before. We all moved toward her in a frantic, ungainly wave. My hands were useless. I remember kneeling and pressing to her temple, because instinct told me to stop the bleeding. Someone called 911. My father tried to lift her and then dropped his head, his face gray and suddenly old. My mother sobbed in short, incoherent bursts. Nathan stood at the edge of the room, hands trembling as if he had been wrung out. Clara was rushed to the hospital. They said she had a concussion, a laceration that required stitches, and a few hours of observation in case swelling developed. They didn't say anything yet about long-term damage. They wouldn't for days. At the time, all the surgeon's words were a fog, and the thing I felt clearest was an extraction of self. I was present, but not in the way I usually was. I was a witness to a catastrophe I had never intended. In the ambulance, Clara's face was pale and muddied with blood, and I sat in the hallway of the emergency room pressing my palms together so hard they hurt. People whispered. Nurses moved with sharp efficiency. Nathan paced, hands rubbing together like a man trying to erase fingerprints. I remember the moment the reality caught up. I had planned to ruin their reputations, to make them feel small and exposed, but I had never planned for a body to hit the floor, for the metallic scent of blood to mix with the antiseptic smell of the hospital. For the first time since I started this, guilt found a way through my armor and set up residence in my chest. They said it was an accident, a misstep, the kind of thing that happened when tempers flared and someone didn't watch their footing. My mother called it tragic. My father, an unfortunate turn. Nathan, damp-eyed and hollow, told the reporters in the parking lot that he couldn't believe it, that he loved Clara, that the argument had been a mistake. His voice was raw in a way that made my stomach twist. But the truth is, accidents don't exist in the vacuum of intent. I had delivered pressure, stoked the friction, set the scene. I had been a hand on the match. That thought hunted me through the fluorescent-lit waiting room and into the quiet hours of the night when the rain outside sounded like confession. When Clara finally woke, eyes ringed with bruising but alive, her first words were not apologies or regret. She looked at me with something like triumph bleeding into her gaze and whispered, "You did this." The room seemed to tilt. I wanted to scream that I hadn't touched her, that it had been a tragedy, that I had never wanted this. Instead, I felt my voice retreat into a faraway place, and the only sound I recognized was the pulse in my ears. No one left that hospital as they had arrived. The fracture I had begun had transformed into a chasm. The family that had once been a house of maps now had a road washed out by a storm, and we were all stranded on different sides, shouting across the water. Clara's recovery was slow, but her venom returned faster than her strength. Within days, she had my mother wrapped around her again, spinning the story to suit her needs. According to Clara, she had been attacked, cornered by me and Nathan in some twisted tag team of cruelty. She painted herself as the fragile survivor of our violence, her bandaged head the crown of martyrdom. My mother believed her, or wanted to. She clung to Clara's version of events like scripture, repeating it to anyone who would listen. Nathan, strangely, didn't correct her. Maybe he thought silence was his safest option. Maybe he knew if he contradicted Clara, she would bury him deeper than I ever could. Either way, his quietness condemned me more than her lies. People looked at me differently. Neighbors, co-workers, even distant relatives who caught wind of the accident. Their eyes asked questions I couldn't answer. For the first time since starting my revenge, I felt trapped inside my own game. I had pulled the strings for months, but now the marionettes had turned, moving on their own, jerking in directions I hadn't planned. Olivia was the only one who didn't flinch when I told her what happened. We sat in her kitchen, rain streaking the windows, the smell of coffee heavy in the air. She listened without judgment, then leaned across the table. "Ev, this isn't about revenge anymore. This is survival. They're going to destroy you if you let them control the story." Her words lit something in me. Not hope, not yet, but clarity. I realized Clara wasn't just my enemy. She was a strategist too. Every lie she spread was a countermove. Every tear, a weapon. If I wanted to survive, I couldn't keep fighting like before. Quiet sabotage wouldn't be enough. I had to rip the mask off entirely. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Nathan's company, already suspicious, scheduled a formal review. I had more evidence tucked away: emails, screenshots, even a voice memo of him bragging about cutting corners. It was risky, but I packaged it all into a neat, anonymous dossier and sent it to his supervisor. A week later, Nathan was suspended indefinitely. His career, the one thing he had always valued above all else, collapsed overnight. I wish I could say I felt triumphant, but watching him spiral was different this time. He didn't lash out, he didn't rage, he just unraveled. He stopped shaving, stopped showing up to family dinners. The last time I saw him, he was slumped in his car outside Clara's house, empty bottles on the passenger seat. He looked like a man who had already buried himself. Clara, meanwhile, played the victim card harder than ever. She gave interviews to small local blogs, painting herself as a woman betrayed not just by a lover, but by her own sister. She posed with gauze, still visible under her hair, her voice trembling just enough to make her performance believable. People sympathized. My mother wept when she read one of the articles, muttering, "Poor Clara, she's been through so much." I wanted to scream, to shake them, to force them to see her for who she really was. But I also knew one thing with bone-deep certainty. Clara had overplayed her hand. Her lies were too perfect, too rehearsed. And I still had one card left that none of them knew about, something sharp enough to cut through every story she spun. All I needed was the right moment to play it. The final blow had to be precise. Months of watching, gathering, and waiting had taught me that revenge isn't about emotion. It's about timing. Clara had grown cocky, convinced that her bruised body and her careful sob stories had made her untouchable. She didn't realize how much I had learned about her. The hidden debts, the flirtations she thought were secret, the emails that could ruin her professionally if anyone connected the dots. And Nathan, crumbling from the suspension, had become predictable, easy to manipulate, a puppet dangling on the strings I controlled. I began by creating a scenario that seemed entirely coincidental. An old college friend of Clara's, someone she hadn't spoken to in years, reached out. Through careful guidance, I had whispered little truths into this friend's ear, facts about Clara's manipulations, her deceit, the way she flaunted Nathan while still chasing attention elsewhere. The friend, gullible and unsuspecting, began asking questions, hinting in messages to others that Clara's fragile victim story didn't add up. Simultaneously, I ensured that Nathan's professional collapse hit a peak. Anonymous tips, carefully timed, reached former clients and colleagues. By now, Nathan's name was linked with mismanagement and deceit online. Each call he received, each meeting where he stumbled over excuses, left him more fragile, more desperate. And every desperate move he made only gave me more leverage. The crucial step was orchestrating their confrontation without them realizing it was my doing. I arranged, through subtle nudges and anonymous messages, for Clara and Nathan to meet at a local cafe, the place they had first confessed to each other about our affair months ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. Nathan showed up first, looking pale, his hands shaking, checking his phone constantly. Clara arrived 10 minutes later, mask perfectly in place, wearing the smile she used to charm everyone. But it didn't reach her eyes. Not fully. I watched from a distance. Nathan tried to apologize, his voice uneven. Clara, practiced and poised, deflected, dismissing his words, hinting at her own grievances, her hardships at my hands. The conversation escalated quickly. Every word was a mine, every gesture a spark. Then, subtly, I sent a message to a mutual friend who had a history of gossip. Just a few words. Record. Everything. The friend, curious and eager, began filming surreptitiously. Minutes later, the scene was explosive. Nathan's frustration boiled over. Clara's act faltered. She raised her voice, fingers pointing, tone sharp. For the first time, everyone watching, strangers in the cafe, the friend recording, saw the tension, the deceit, the real dynamic between them. The carefully curated image of a perfect couple collapsed under the weight of truth. By the time they left, both were humiliated. Nathan's suspension became public in full, and Clara's manipulations were mirrored in the recording, showing her flirtations, her lies, her cruelty. The footage spread quietly online, picked up by small blogs, then forums, Then social media. People began connecting the dots. Comments appeared, sympathetic at first to Clara, then questioning her story. Nathan's reputation plummeted further. I didn't celebrate, I observed. Watching them stumble, watching their carefully constructed lives fracture, I realized something profound. Power felt hollow without closure. I had delivered the blow, but I was no longer the naive, broken girl. I had become someone else entirely, someone capable of patience, strategy, and cold calculation. That night, lying in my bed, I thought of Nathan slumped in his apartment, of Clara staring at the ceiling in the dark, replaying their public humiliation. And I understood that this story, our story, was finally complete. I had reshaped the narrative. I had reclaimed my power. Yet the satisfaction was tempered with the shadow of what it had taken from me, the pieces of innocence, the trust in others, the belief in family. The cost of revenge was not theirs alone, it was mine as well. But for the first time in months, I slept without nightmares. The storm had passed, and I had survived, not unscathed, but undeniably stronger. The aftermath of the confrontation left a strange kind of silence in its wake. Clara avoided me publicly, but whispered venom behind closed doors. Nathan barely left his apartment, nursing his humiliation and a growing bitterness that I could almost taste. My mother oscillated between guilt and denial, desperately clinging to her version of events, while my father sank further into quiet resignation. The household had become a landscape of invisible lines, territories marked by tension and unspoken resentments. I tried to live normally. Work demanded my attention, friends needed me, and Olivia kept me tethered to something resembling morality. Yet everywhere I went, my mind returned to the fractures I had created. I watched Nathan on social media, his pride shattered in tiny fragments. Tweets deleted, LinkedIn profiles updated to obscure positions, vague posts about life lessons that no one believed. Clara's accounts followed the same trajectory, peppered with apologies that rang hollow to anyone who knew the truth. Even as they struggled, I felt a tug of unease. Revenge had a way of echoing back, reshaping the person wielding it. I began to see myself differently, sharper, colder, unrelenting. Friends noticed it in my tone, the way I dismissed small slight, the patience with which I plotted solutions to problems that didn't require such strategy. Olivia confronted me again, her voice calm but insistent. "Ev, you've won," she said. "Why keep fighting ghosts?" I didn't answer. The truth was, the fight had never been about winning. It had been about surviving, about reclaiming agency in a world where my family had once made me invisible. And now that I held it, I couldn't let it go. Then, one night, Clara appeared at my door. Her hair was tied back, her face pale, eyes wide with something between fear and desperation. She didn't knock, she didn't ring the bell, she just stood there, waiting. "I need to talk," she said. Her voice was unsteady, almost pleading. "Please, just 5 minutes." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to slam the door, let her fume in the night, leave her standing in the cold. Part of me wanted to see what she would do, to measure her desperation firsthand. Finally, I opened the door. She stepped inside like she owned nothing, but demanded everything. Her words tumbled out in a chaotic mix of apologies, accusations, and confessions. She admitted to the lies, the manipulations, the secret debts, the flirtations she had hidden. Nathan, she claimed, had forced her into certain acts she regretted. But she also took responsibility for her own choices. Her voice broke on some sentences. She laughed bitterly on others. I listened. For the first time in months, I let her speak without interruption, without judgment. And as I heard the truth from her lips, unpolished and raw, I realized something terrifying. I no longer wanted vengeance. The rage that had fueled me was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it no longer defined me. I understood that the narrative I had created, the public humiliation, the exposure of secrets, the careful dismantling of lives, was complete. Clara and Nathan had been forced to confront themselves in ways they would never forget. When she finished, she looked at me, eyes wide. "What now?" she whispered. I took a deep breath. I could destroy her further, or I could walk away. The choice was mine, as it always had been. And for the first time, I chose something else. The days after Clara's confession felt like the first quiet morning after a storm. The city outside carried on, oblivious to the wreckage left in the wake of my carefully orchestrated chaos. Inside, however, the household that had been my prison for so long was transformed. Not healed, not reconciled, but fractured in a way that made room for truth. Nathan vanished from social circles entirely. He stopped calling, stopped showing up at the office, stopped pretending. He had been reduced to a ghost of his former arrogance, a man forced to reckon with the consequences of his pride. Clara remained, still weaving apologies and explanations into public posts, but the veneer of perfection had cracked irreparably. People began to see her differently, not entirely condemning, but not admiring either. The pedestal she had once stood on had been replaced with a cautious scrutiny, and the power she had wielded was gone. I, too, had changed. Revenge had been a teacher harsher than any school or mentor could provide. I learned that orchestrating downfall required patience, observation, and precision, but it also exacted a toll. Nights were sleepless with guilt and calculation. Days were lonely with the burden of secrets only I carried. The satisfaction of watching them stumble had been real, intoxicating even, but it had not erased the years of hurt, nor the scar left by my mother's favoritism. Olivia stayed by my side, a tether to the part of me that remained humane. She reminded me that survival wasn't the same as victory, that reclaiming agency didn't need to destroy my soul. I realized then that revenge is a powerful lens through which to see the world, but it is not life itself. Life is messy, unpredictable, and sometimes cruel, but it also has the quiet moments of clarity that allow you to choose who you will become. Months later, at another family gathering, I sat quietly at the edge of the room. My mother fussed over Clara, whose bandaged arm had long healed, whispering advice and praise. Nathan didn't attend. The air between us was tentative, but not hostile. I didn't gloat. I didn't speak. I merely watched, absorbing the weight of all that had happened, understanding the finality of the path I had walked. Clara caught my eye and offered a small, fleeting smile. Less triumphant now, more human. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to respond with malice. She had survived. I had survived. And the fractures we carried were ours to bear. I left that night with a sense of calm I hadn't known in years. The revenge had run its course, leaving truth in its place. And for the first time, I could consider the future without being anchored to the past, without counting grievances or planning moves in a lifelong game of chess. In the quiet of my apartment, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The family that had shaped my pain was still imperfect, still tangled in ego and pride, but I had reclaimed my story. I had reclaimed myself, and though the scars of revenge would never fully fade, they reminded me of one indelible truth. Power is not in hurting others. It is in surviving, learning, and knowing that even in a world full of betrayal, you are capable of emerging whole. I closed my eyes that night, and for the first time in a long time, I slept without dreams of broken glass or blood, without the endless calculus of justice and punishment. I had walked through the fire, and I had emerged alive, aware, and unbroken. And that, I realized, was the greatest revenge of all, not destruction, but liberation.